Thanks very much for joining us on Green Live. You can hopefully see us on Twitter, Facebook and Twitch. And throughout our discussion, you'll be able to add any comments or questions. We'll try to deal with those as we go along. I'm Patrick Harvey. I'm co-leader of the Scottish Green Party. And like everybody at the moment, the Greens have been getting used to new ways of working. We can't hold branch meetings or public meetings or conferences. And so we're trying to host some of these discussions online in an open and collaborative way, hopefully hearing from you as well as just speaking about some of the issues. There's a huge opportunity to carry on exploring the green vision for Scotland's future and to involve you in that discussion, as well as to address the immediate urgent crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic is causing for our society and for everybody here and around the world. But there are also some really fundamental links between the two. Some really strong reasons why green ideas, long-standing green ideas, are more relevant now than they've ever been before. And we're going to be exploring some of those themes as well. Today's topic is universal basic income. And next week you can join my fellow co-leader, Lorna Slater, who'll be talking about the climate emergency and about talking to some of the climate strikers about how they're adapting their movement to the current circumstances. For today, though, on universal basic income, one of the things that the current crisis has exposed so clearly is the vulnerability of people who've been left with precarious incomes, including low incomes, but also people who are further up the income scale whose income is just precarious. They've lost work, they've lost their income, and the idea of a universal basic income would be, in many people's view, and a long-standing Green policy, a much simpler way of ensuring that everybody's basic needs are met. I'm joined today by two guests who are going to be discussing this with me. Cleo Goodman is Director of the Citizen Basic Income Network Scotland, and Jamie Cook's the head of RSA Scotland, an executive committee member of the Basic Income Earth Network. Thanks both of you for coming into our little virtual space to discuss these issues. How are you coping with the current crisis yourselves? How are you coping with new ways of working and living?
Yeah, not so bad. I do a bit of working from home anyway. I miss co-working spaces. I work for one in Edinburgh, but yeah, me and my flatmate are struggling through.
And Jamie, you keeping well?
Yes. Again, I work from home normally, so in that sense, it's not a huge shock to the system. But my three kids being home with me all the time, it's a bit more so. I've certainly been very grateful to have a garden and have some very un-Scottish weather recently, and I think really does show, as you said, the difference of how we're all experiencing the current crisis.
So I'd like to start by asking both of you to say a little bit about what work you've been doing on UBI, and that might not have changed very much if you're used to working from home, the kind of activity that your organisations have been doing. But what's going on in the UBI space, if you like, in Scotland? What have your priorities been? And also maybe just give us a little bit more of a perspective of what universal basic income means to you. Can I start with Cleo?
Yeah, of course. So I wear two hats in my basic income work. Director of Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland. And it's kind of been quite similar. We've not changed too much other than the fact that we're a volunteer-led charity that now can't meet in person anymore, which is obviously a bit of a shame. It's nice to get to connect with the community when you're doing this kind of work. But we've moved onto Zoom calls like most people have. So continuing the momentum there a little bit. Our main priority at the moment is to prepare for the launch of the final report from the Scottish Basic Income Experiment feasibility study, so we can do what we can to disseminate that wonderful research and to continue the momentum around basic income in Scotland. My other hat is co-founder of Basic Income Conversation, which is a new sort of branch of the organisation Compass. So we were just finding our feet in terms of what it is that we were to do as an organisation and how we were contributing to the basic income movement, and obviously that has shifted massively. So with the Basic Income Conversation, we work UK-wide rather than with a specific Scottish focus, but it's been amazing the last few weeks to work as a UK movement with groups like Basic Income UK and the UBI Lab network across largely the north of England, but also around the world. But I think we've done some really great collaborative working, so that's been really exciting. most recently getting this letter published in the Financial Times that was signed by over 100 MPs and peers, asking to explore a basic income as a recovery measure for the crisis that we're currently going through. And generally, what basic income is to me, it's an unconditional cash payment that everyone receives regardless of their circumstance forever. At the moment, it's not something that we have in place, but that's kind of partly why it's so exciting to me, because it's something that we can build together, you know, and particularly in Scotland as a country with big aspirations for a changed future, and basic income can be a proper central tenet of that can leave people in a significantly better situation on an individual level, but also enable us as a community and as a society to work on things that matter, and that's, you know, for each other and for ourselves.
And Jamie, are you getting that same sense of excitement around this? Because, you know, UBI has been around for a long time. From my point of view, it's been Green Party policy for decades, but it's got a lot more attention in the last few years. You know, maybe that's overdue, but it has been growing in awareness. And in the current crisis, the sense that this could be a way to meet people's immediate needs, but also a way out of the crisis, so that economic recovery means something different than just getting back to a broken normal. Is that a sense of optimism that you've got around this topic at the moment as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the last few years, I first got involved in basic income in 2016. So we at the RSA have an annual conference in Scotland, the Angus Miller Lecture, and we invited Guy Standing, who's a very well-known speaker and contributor in the basic income movement, to give the Angus Miller Lecture that year. And to be honest, it wasn't really a topic that was under much discussion. From my own perspective, if I'm being brutally honest, I didn't see it as a policy that we were going to deliver. I saw it as a very useful provocation around the failings that there were in social security and in the economy. But what really struck me very quickly, and also what we've seen in Scotland over that period of time, was the speed with which you could see it started to answer and offer spaces for some of the big challenges we were facing around the economic insecurity you've talked about, the precarious nature of work and of lives, but actually also just fundamentally about fairness. You know, and I think Cleo touched on a lot of the things that really attract me to a basic income, but for me, it's about that resetting of the social contract. It's been frayed, it's been torn apart over recent years, much of it behind the scenes, never being put to the public as an actual policy for voting on, and actually has really created this situation where now we have a social security system and universal credit that is based on punishment, it's based on presuming that everyone's out to game the system, it's based on forcing people to jump through hoops. And it's little wonder that therefore we've seen breakdowns in social connections and trust in society and in the state and in each other. And actually this current crisis is horrific. And first and foremost, our response must be about the immediate protection of others. But it started to show up both those fundamental failings that we've touched on, but also the fundamental good that there is out there in society. We've seen an outpouring of, I think, empathy for people we will never meet that is incredible, and I think creates a really positive space for future change. You know, we're accepting restrictions on our freedoms and our movements because we want to protect people who are more vulnerable than ourselves. And I think that creates a really useful space for us. And I think you can see that since the beginning of this crisis, I would say particularly in Scotland, the debate, the political debate, the civic debate around basic income, which was already vibrant, you know, and we're very grateful to the long-standing commitment, support and drive that the Scottish Green Party has brought to that, but has suddenly, I would say, let forward by probably a year to 2 years. You know, from going into this crisis, a discussion around, is this an idea we should test, we should explore, to actually now hearing, you know, the First Minister talk about if she had the powers, she would deliver a basic income now. Yeah. Hearing parties like the Lib Dems, who haven't been involved, certainly not in recent times, talking about the need for cross-border discussions and debates and so on. So I think it's really exciting in that sense. I think we can't take for granted that we'll make the progress. But I think going back to what Cleo said about the kind of collegiate and collaborative work that's been taking place across Scotland, across the UK, and indeed across the world, it's a really exciting time, and I think gives us, particularly here in Scotland, a fantastic opportunity to be both world leaders, but also learning from what's happening in other parts of the planet as well.
There is something, isn't there, about a crisis, a moment when we are forced not only to deal with the immediate harm that's being done by the pandemic, but being forced also to do some deep thinking about what kind of society we are and what's actually important to us. And obviously, people who've lost their incomes, they need enough income to meet their basic needs. But also, you look at the other things people are missing. People are missing spending time with each other. People are missing just being social, stuff that isn't always about material needs. And some of those things you were saying about the changes to the social security system, the shift away from a system that's designed to meet all of our needs, to look after us from cradle to grave, into a system that's designed, well, A, it assumes the worst of us all, and B, it bullies people into low-paid, precarious work, and then, to a certain extent, subsidises that low-paid, precarious work so that employers don't have to pay what people need to live with dignity. So the idea of a UBI is partly, yes, about that immediate need, but it's also about thinking differently about the kind of society and the kind of economy that we want to live in, where we're not just forced onto that treadmill, but where basic needs are met and people are liberated to make other choices in their lives. A lot of the questions that we've had coming in so far, though, are about the practicalities. How much would it be, for example? We've got a lot of questions here. Ellen, Sam, Shirley and Pat have all raised some early questions around how much it would be. Now, the first time the Greens tried to put some flesh on the bones of this and say, how could we cost out a UBI for Scotland? That was during the 2014 independence referendum, and we wanted to set out some ideas about an alternative approach if Scotland had the power to do this off its own bat. And we come up with something that was about £100 a week. Other think tanks more recently have pitched it at about the same level. Mm-hmm. Some of the questions and comments here suggest that wouldn't be enough, that it would have to be significantly more than that if it's going to really meet all of people's needs. For example, including housing costs, people who have additional needs in terms of disability and so on. Where would you pitch the level at it? How much should a UBI be set at? And would it be about counting all of those costs in together, or would there be some separate benefits that you would continue to pay separately just for those who have specific needs? Who'd like to start on that batch of issues?
Do you want to go, Jamie?
Sure. I always joke whenever I do public talks on basic income. I always say I never give a figure during the talk because it's always wrong. It's either too high or it's too low. I think it's really interesting in a few points. So first thing I want to really emphasise, because I know this came up in some of the other questions and it comes up a lot in the discussions that I have, Cleo has, and all the rest of us do. So disability support would be separate to a basic income. A basic income is the general support and basis that all of us get as eligible citizens or residents. I'm sure we can discuss that later on. Disability support is individual by its very nature, and that must always be an additional support that has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So I think that's an important one to emphasise, because otherwise it can look very unfair that we're treating everybody the same when obviously those kind of needs are quite different. There's also fundamentally just an issue with trying to fit housing benefit into basic income, and that's because of the complete imbalances we have in our housing markets. So it's very, very hard. I mean, when you look at a UK level, to try and balance the southeast of England and London with the rest of the UK is just ridiculous. But even in Scotland, trying to balance out is very difficult. I think what it shows, and this is another thing I think is very important to emphasise, is a basic income is not a silver bullet. It doesn't answer every problem in society. It's a foundation. You build other policies on top of it. So a basic income being introduced would require, a kind of cap on rent increases and having rent controls in place to stop that just vanishing. It would need a living wage to continue alongside it. So I think it's important to say that some of these bits, unfortunately, will kind of need to be built into the system. As you say, I think most proposals in the UK have been around about that mark. So they've varied, they're £100 a week. So they've varied slightly. Our most recent report we published last year at the RSA with a report for Scotland had it slightly, so it was £4,800 per year per adult, but we had a slightly higher level for children, whereas I know the Green proposal and Reform Scotland's proposal, for example, had slightly higher for adults and slightly lower for children. So, there's but all much of a muchness. I think there's something that's come out of the recent crisis, though, that really starts to become interesting around that. There's two things. So one is there's been a lot of discussion about higher levels that I don't think was really taking place before. Now, some of that's linked, to be honest, so you may have seen Andrew Yang's campaign in the US for nomination for Democratic candidate for president. He was suggesting, in true American style, a freedom dividend, because you have to add freedom to the but he was talking about $1,000 a month. And I've started to hear more people talking about £1,000 a month, because I think it has a nice ring to it. It's a nice round number. Obviously, that's considerably more than has been talked about previously in any of our pitches, and I think would require a lot of looking at the costs and the associated risk. But I think part of the interesting fact is that most of us, and I don't want to speak to the policy you put out previously, Patrick, with the Greens, but I think certainly with what we've done at the RSA, we've tended to pitch the support and the level of basic income around existing levels of benefit support. And I think that's because we've seen it as the way to get into the public discourse as a starting point. You can cost it, it's a proposal, but also it doesn't seem massively different from what's there. I think one of the things that's happening in the current crisis is that far more people are suddenly experiencing what universal credit and social security is like. Far more people are being forced into that and are realising that all this time we've been told it's for spongers and scroungers and they're living the life of luxury, that actually it's completely false. It's a horrific process and it's really hurting people. And I actually am really interested to see coming through this crisis whether the interest and support in higher levels of basic income actually starts to grow now, because rather than having to place it in a publicly accepted manner, perhaps there's more openness to ideas of that spend. But I think you're quite right. I think so far it's looked at around those levels. What I would throw in, because a lot of people do instinctively say that seems like a very low level of support, and I would throw in two things. One is, as you start, these are paid individually, but as you start to add those into partners and family units and so on, they do start to add up quite quickly. So you can actually get quite a good amount of money put in there. I think the other thing is that with the modelling we did for our report last year, even that £4,800 per year level, which we believe is fully deliverable for Scotland, under Joseph Rowntree Foundation's modelling of destitution, it's eliminated destitution completely in Scotland. So even at low levels, we can have quite significant impacts on both health and well-being, and I'm sure we'll talk about the finished results shortly, but also on people's economic security. So I think I'm up for discussions around how big we make it, but I think even at these common levels we've discussed, there's a chance for real impact in Scotland.
Yeah, that sense that maybe the interest in this, particularly in higher levels of it, is because people used to a higher level of income are now facing crisis, and that sense that Social Security isn't just for some stigmatized other group. It's about everybody's needs. That's always been one of the attractions of UBI, that it kind of breaks down this artificial division between those who contribute, those who pay in, and those who get something back. Really, we all get back from what we pay for collectively, whether that's through public services, whether it's through infrastructure, or indeed UBI would be another model of demonstrating that sense of being members of a society as opposed to a transactional relationship, as though you're living in a hotel instead of a society. Cleo, where do you fit on these issues around how much it should be pitched at? Should it be calculated according to what people's basic needs are, a little bit like a living wage, or should it be more about what society can afford? How do you deal with these issues around what is a basic income?
Yeah, I feel like I'm lucky because I'm in a position where I'm joining the conversation about basic income when it's quite established. And I have colleagues political colleagues like yourselves at the Greens who have fantastic comprehensive proposals for basic income. And there's so many wonderful economists and think tanks like the RSA doing these number crunching bits of work, which are really important because we do need to be able to answer the questions about details. But I feel like we're ready now in the basic income debate to really open it up and ask people what they think it needs to do. And like, I'm really, really keen that that's where we build a basic income from. It's asking people what needs they have and how a basic income could meet them. And yeah, not treating it like it's a silver bullet and an answer to everything unless we build it to be so. Like, we need to do a lot of work to understand how we build something that doesn't leave people worse off, that doesn't leave people brutalized by a system as they currently are. So, I mean, I have personal opinions on it, of course. Like, I think I would love to see a basic income that is enough to live off of, because I think that allows it to fulfill its full potential, that allows people to change the way they work and to change the way they spend their time. But obviously, in practical terms, you've got to think about how that's implemented, and it would need to be implemented in stages. I would like to see conditions removed from existing systems as the first, and as quickly as possible, because I think those conditions are doing harm to people right now, and that's unacceptable.
You mean taking existing benefits and making them universal?
Making them unconditional, yeah. So starting by removing the means testing aspects from existing benefits and doing it more on a needs basis in a compassionate kind of fashion. Because we need to get used to doing that if we're going to have a basic income that really functions, because that's the cornerstone, I think, of a basic income, that it is unconditional. And then we think about universality, so giving something to everyone. And that's when you need to really cost it up and think about the payments. And maybe a starting point for that is something like £100, which would make a massive difference to people. Like Jamie says, if we can remove destitution, we should do that. We should absolutely do that.
One of the comments that we've had in while we've been talking suggests that a UBI should be indexed to inflation so that it isn't worthless, it doesn't degrade over time. The comparison would be when the minimum wage was brought in the UK. Really important step forward. It's difficult sometimes to remember how low some people's pay was before a legal minimum, but it then just withered on the vine. It wasn't keeping up with the cost of living, and that's why the pressure grew so much for the living wage campaign, and more employers paying that, but it's still voluntary. Should a universal basic income, when it's established, in with the bricks, should be the principle that it's going to keep up with the cost of living?
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion and idea, because I think, from a kind of political and policy perspective, I think sometimes, and I've argued this before, is that you get it in the system, and once it's there, it's going to be very hard to remove again. So in a sense, that does, suggest you can go at a lower level to go in. But I think you're quite right. The risk that it does stagnate and become less useful than it could be, I think, is an important aspect to address. I do think it ties into, quite often people worry that would a basic income push inflation as well, and I think that we have to again see it within the wider policy framework and economic framework. So you would take other measures around taxation and so on to try and address that. But no, I think ensuring that this is seen as, this isn't just a great, we've ticked off a measure here, everything's great, can't we move on? This, as we said earlier, is about that reimagined social contract. And the only way the social contract remains vibrant and powerful is by us keeping it alive. It's by allowing it to grow and to evolve. I mean, I often say, beverage, our previous period of crisis that led to some significant changes, and remembering today, 75 years on, was a time of war. Beverage identified giants for us to face. I don't think those giants have gone away, but they've changed and they've evolved and taken different forms. I don't think our systems have done the same, and actually quite often have been deliberately undermined from doing so. So I think the principle, whether that's directly through legislative links to inflation, whether it's through other measures, kind of an external grouping who start to look at that in line with sometimes how we've tried to look at pay scales in certain areas. I think there's a number of ways you could look at it, but something that says this is growing and living and needs to be sustained, I think, is essential to make it not just another policy idea.
And Cleo, some of the other questions that we've got coming in move on from this question about what is that basic minimum, and actually talk about high pay, excessive pay, as another side of the same problem. some people are asking, shouldn't there be a cut-off? Why should people earning 40, 50, 60,000 pounds get a universal basic income as well? Or should there actually be limits on high pay? How do you deal with the arguments around, making sure that this meets everybody's basic needs, but at the same time, some people react against that argument for universality because some people who just don't need it would still be getting it. What's your response to that, Cleo?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some questions around that. I think generally people on super high pay, there would be changes to the way that they would be taxed, so they wouldn't end up getting a basic income on top of their pay. It's likely that they would either be making the same amount or less with their basic income contribution in there. I'm absolutely adamant that it should be universal and unconditional. And I think as soon as you add in things like caps and stopping some people getting it because they earn X amount, that builds in conditions and removes universality. And I don't know, I think there's something quite important in the gesture of everyone getting it and everyone being united in seeing their basic income coming in. And also I think we need to kind of really address this idea that just because you're earning this kind of wage, that doesn't actually equate to a certain type of happiness. There's a different element to well-being that's not just around your means. And there might be people on high-paying jobs that want to quit those jobs, and if they had a basic income, they might do. And that's maybe a bit of a wacky proposal, but they should be able to do that too. And I think basic income is partly about creating the conditions where they can do that, where you have this security to make big changes to your life and particularly around your work. So that's kind of how I feel about the high earning question.
Yeah. No, I think that last point is really, for me, connected to this idea of actually this being something liberating. Some on the political right like to talk about freedom as though they own the idea, as though right-wing ideas are all about freedom and the left doesn't care about freedom. Actually, if we look at the kind of economy that we've had in recent years and decades, people at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder are left with no freedom. They don't have the ability to make meaningful choices in their lives. And actually, a lot of people higher up the income scale feel also that they have to stay on that treadmill. This isn't really the kind of economics that makes people free to make choices in their lives. But a UBI, knowing that everybody's got that basic platform, that level of security that's not going away, that actually liberates people to make choices that are meaningful in their lives, whether that's about work, starting a business, being creative, about family and caring responsibilities. Having the ability to make those choices would be much more liberating.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that's a really powerful part of the call and the vision to basic income. It's not just an economic or a social policy, it's actually a reimagining of the kind of society we want to have. And I think when you look at the strongest parts that still exist in our social contract today, probably the NHS is the one that most people rally round. And we don't ask people when they show up for, we take great pride in the fact that when you show up to the NHS, you don't get asked if you've got enough money. We also don't ask people if you've got too much money. We see it as something that everybody is able to take part in. And I think, Claire's quite right. Once you start to break that down, where we've seen benefits or supports or elements of society become more targeted, then they do start to be the ones that are attacked first because people have less buy-in and interest. I think the other thing, we've talked a lot about the precarious nature of work and the economy. I mean, we've certainly found at the RSA, if you look at the UK as a whole, 35% of people have less than £500 in savings, and you're up to nearly 50% once you look at £1,000 in savings. Insecurity goes quite high up the financial scales now, let alone, I think, the very powerful points around well-being. So this is recognising that there are people at the top of the scale, and as Cleo said, they will not be financial beneficiaries overall to this. They will back into it, but they will still be reminded and part of something bigger that we're all part of, that is society.
There are people who, from a more progressive viewpoint, would express concerns about a UBI, about the potential that, effectively, especially in relation to something like automation and the use of technology and AI to replace a lot of jobs, you're going to have whole swathes of the population who just left on UBI, and that's all they can look forward to. That's their only economic prospect. That it's kind of like just beaching people on that basic level of income with no prospect of anything else. Or others, on the flip side, would say, actually, people in what's currently low-paid work, if they know that they're able to leave because they've got the UBI, it increases their bargaining power. It increases their negotiating power with employers. They're only going to have to take that work if it's genuinely being paid at a level that's worth their while, that it actually makes their lives better to be doing that work. So, what are the pros and cons about these dangers that people might be left with UBI and no prospect of anything else? Or would it actually increase people's bargaining power and force up the level of pay in what's currently low paid, but as we're learning nowadays, really, really critical areas of our society?
I think this is another place where we have to be really clear that basic income can't do all of these things on its own. You need to design adjacent policies or just adjacent social movements alongside a basic income that allow you to ensure that no one is, that you're not having swathes of people beached on a basic income, because that sounds horrendous, and that's absolutely something to avoid. Like, a basic income should be about taking back meaningful work for people and based on their actual needs and the reality of their lives, rather than adding a new problem to that. And actually, I think this is where we really need to make sure that we're aligning ourselves with the unions, because I think at the moment the conversation about basic income within unions is very concerned about this, and it's a fair concern for sure. Like, if we're, their expertise is in the current world of work and the historical world of work, and the concept of basic income is very aside from that, and there's a lot of reconceptualizing that needs to be done alongside that. So to build one that functions and to build one that changes work in the way that work needs to change, and this includes the gig economy. Like, so many people are currently in types of work that don't have any bargaining power right now. Like, people don't have bargaining power. Like, people are working through apps, and they're working on 0-hour contracts, and they're not organized. We don't have like a functional response to these injustices, and people are getting more and more precarious, as we've said. So I feel like the reason that I focus on a basic income so much is because we need that almost as a sticking plaster to allow people to move to do that bit of meaningful work around addressing the problems with the world of work at the moment, which you don't get paid for. So you need to have an income to be able to fight that fight, and we don't at the moment. Yeah.
I'm glad you've made that point about unions so strongly, because, I think from around the world, the objective evidence is so strong. We know that, high levels of union membership and union rights lead to, less inequality in pay, more productivity and better well-being in the workplace. That would be the case even if we had a basic income as well.
Yeah.
A basic income wouldn't change that nature of reality, because that's around power in the economy as well as the fundamentals of distribution. I've got a couple of other questions that I'll come to. Lorraine has asked, would a UBI replace state pension or augment it? I'm a WASPy woman. I want to know if I got a UBI, would it stop when I'm 66 and I finally get my pension? Jamie, have you got any take on that? How do pension systems integrate with UBI?
So the way we've modelled it, and I think most people have, is that you continue to have, so you would have one level of basic income for children. So I would suggest in Scotland that would be up to the age of 16. You then have an adult rate from 16 up till retirement age, and then you have a basic income rate at a pension level that is for retired people. And I think the critical aspect there is that it removes the contributory aspect of it. So everybody would receive that basic income pension. It wouldn't be based on the horrific issues we've seen for WASPy women and many others in terms of contributions being held back against them. And going back to what Claire was saying, because really critical work has not been recognised and valued as such. So this would allow people to know that, yes, actually the level would go up a wee bit when you got to that age, because there would be the presumption you might not be working in other ways as much, but you would still get that equivalent of a pension when you hit
Can I make a wee request around that for people who are receiving a pension or aren't receiving a pension and maybe should have been? If you could tell us what you think about a basic income and how that should work for you, like just tweet us, like I'm at Cleo Goodman. So just to hear you directly and like your response to what Jamie's just said, what the RSA proposed, would that work? I think those conversations are really important to be having with people.
So some of the other questions that we've had coming in, possibly the most common question that you'll get when you start talking about UBI, how are you going to pay for it? How would we pay for it? Would this be, in your view, something that just is tied to a reformulated tax system? That high income tax earners are the ones who are footing the bill for this. Would it be around? Some people have made the case for land value tax as being the fundamental basis of it. Others would say, let's look at corporations and the way that they've been given massive tax breaks over the years. Is it all about using the tax system, or are there other ways of making this system work? That it's not just a massive bill that you're adding to the public purse, but you're making the economy work in a different way to deliver it.
Yeah, 100%. To me, income tax is always important, and I think we need to look at ensuring we have a fair and progressive tax system. However, if we're talking about this as a new basis to society as we want it for the century ahead of us and moving forward, I think we need to look at how we function as a state and as an economy in general. So I don't think it's enough to just, it changes things enough to just go, we'll tax people at the top more and do nothing else. We do need to look at land value taxation. We need to look at data, probably the biggest resource of the 21st century that is currently flowing out the country and into very private and very deep pockets just now. There are a number of ways we need to look at that. But I think as well, fundamentally, basic income is an investment. One of the things I think used to be, and we talked earlier about maybe the levels, how we pitch the levels will change if society changes its views. I think one of the failings we sometimes had in the beginning was trying to pitch basic income as cost neutral. And actually, basic income costs money. It's an investment. We should be investing in society. Now, when we invest in it, when we spend that money, we will see benefits that come back and save money down the line. But that's not the fundamental push for it. But when you look at the results have just come out from the Finnish experiment that they held recently. Now, it's worth saying, caveats, it was a very limited experiment. It was only 2,000 people receiving unemployment benefit who basically had the conditionality taken away. So it's limited in terms of the overarching impacts. But what you see come out of it is the benefits to people's health and well-being, to their perceptions of security and to their perception of trust in society. If you go back to older experiments, so in Manitoba in Canada in the 70s, they tried a minimum income, which is a similar type scheme, and you saw hospital admissions dropped for certain things because people were healthier, they felt better, mental health issues were addressed. You saved money overall as a society if you carried it out. Kids stayed in school longer, go on to better jobs, to have new ideas. People create new businesses. And I think for me, it's about that investment. I remember last year, the Conservatives used the freedom of information and made it, or maybe even been 2 years ago now, at Parliament, made a big thing about, the civil servant has said this will cost £12 billion a year for Scotland. Now, firstly, that was not including anything that would be removed to help pay for it. So of course, it was way more than expected. But I was really struck when I spoke about it afterwards. The response from people was, all right, that's a lot less than I expected, rather than seeing that as an insurmountable number. And I think if we go in with it as investment in future and society, then I think we find the money and we build into that as we go forward. But I think it's eminently achievable. And it's amazing how magic money trees suddenly appear when certain people come looking for them.
Yes, there are no capitalists in a pandemic. Apparently, it's everybody's suddenly rediscovering the need to come running to the state for help. Cleo, I think you were the one who mentioned earlier some of the stuff that's happening in Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon making some comments about UBI. So the work that Jamie was talking about there, the report from Finland, just the latest in a range of experiments or attempts to move in this direction. None of them perfect. I don't think anyone would claim that any of them have been perfect. But there has also been some work trying to get pilot work happening in councils in Scotland, and the Scottish Government has been supportive of that. And as you said, the First Minister has given even more emphasis to UBI in the context of the current crisis. Where do you see things, Cleo, in terms of Scotland? What has Scotland been doing, but what can we do? Several of the questions that we've had coming in online are basically boiling down to, can we actually do this? Can we do this now? Would we need to be independent, or would we need Westminster to give us permission to do it? So how much can Scotland do, and what is happening at the moment here at the domestic level?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So far, the significant work that's been done in Scotland has been around looking at the feasibility of an experiment. So this was led by 4 local authorities: Glasgow, Edinburgh, North Ayrshire and Fife. Scottish Government funded this with £250,000. It's a big comprehensive bit of research looking at everything from kind of how you can experiment with a policy like basic income, which is universal and unconditional by design, and an experiment is not universal and very conditional by design, deliberately. So that's all been really fascinating. The final report on that will be published fairly soon, over the next few months, and that will make a recommendation to Scottish Government around a pilot. And as Jamie says, the kind of the asks have shifted a lot over the last few months. Around, it was always pilots that people were asking for, and now it feels almost like we're able to ask for a full basic income. So yeah, there's some questions around that, around how we manage piloting and kind of the ethics of piloting during a situation like we're currently in. One of the key findings of this bit of research is around what we can do as Scotland right now with the devolved powers, and that will be in the final report. So, I mean, reality is we're still asking Westminster to allow us to do these things. We don't have the powers to do an experiment or a full basic income, but the final report will give us real clarity on what the specific barriers are there. So that gives us some real specific things to work towards. And then questions around how we pay for it in an independent Scotland for greater political and economic minds than myself. But I think what the key priority here is that we all educate ourselves around basic income and what we would want from a basic income. We read this report that's coming out and make sure we know what the barriers to that are, and we know what we're advocating for, and we know what we're asking for, so we can put pressure on our government in Scotland and UK-wide to move us towards that. I think that's the really crucial moment we're at right now, is for us to work very competently together to push for this, because it is a big ask. It's a big investment, whether it's an experiment or a full policy, but it's one that, well, I certainly believe needs to be made. And I think a lot of people, or anyone that agrees with me there, I think let's all work together to make sure that it does happen, because it's going to be a bit of work that needs to be done, I think, still.
It's a big bit of work, and I've always had slightly conflicted feelings about pilots on this, because I do want to see movement, I do want to see progress and work that tries to engage more people in the idea of a UBI, but there's always a little bit of a kind of doubting voice at the back of my mind. A pilot, by definition, isn't universal. How can a pilot really tell you how people would change their behaviour, how people would change their attitudes, and how you would meet people's basic needs under a universal system when the pilot itself can never be? Jamie, have you got a view on the limitations of pilots? And in particular, we've seen, as you were both saying, more interest in this right across the political spectrum. Scottish Government's now supportive. The UK Government isn't supportive, but some Tories are. The Labour Party at the moment at UK level isn't supportive, but many people within Labour are. So there's a growing, but not yet a fully dominant support for this in many parts of the political spectrum. And a lot of the Tories' kind of shtick around the last election was, we want to be the government that levels up. UBI could be a really powerful way of making that a reality. So should we just be pushing for, let's go the whole hog, or do pilots really have the ability to generate useful data about how a universal system would actually operate and the effects that it would have?
So I think it's a very contentious area for debate just now, particularly within the basic income movement. People like Carl Widerquist from the US have written a lot on how he actually sees pilots and experiments as being quite a dangerous route, because they can quite often be a way to push things into the long grass and to set impossible targets. So if you look at the Finnish example, when the interim results came out, so before it was launched, opponents had said, this is going to be a disaster because you get people on basic income and they won't work. They're going to all stop their work because they're going to be lazy. And the interim results came out and showed that there hadn't really been a significant difference to how people were working one way or the other. And so the same people had said this will make them work less said, well, see, it's a disaster. They didn't work more, and had flipped the decisions of what they constituted success as being overnight because it fitted their political narrative. So I think, for me, that there was a huge step in getting the Scottish Government's support for the feasibility study and potential experiments, because it showed a significant step forward for where the government was at the time. So when I first had conversations, I would be told, look, we're really interested, and one day in an independent Scotland, we'll think about it. And I would say, well, if that were to happen, you'd be talking about a generation down the line, because you're not going to suddenly introduce a new system as you're transitioning. To bring forward the experimentation and the discussions, I think fitted very much within a narrative of this is something for certainly the medium term, if not the longer term. It's not going to happen soon. The reality is, as Claire has touched on, we can't deliver a basic income in Scotland just now. We don't have control. We have 15% social security. We don't have the fiscal power to deliver a full basic income, and actually even to deliver an experiment of that size and scale, because particularly the DWP, in my opinion. And I think the scale and the debate has changed. So I think the report coming out will be really, really useful around the barriers and challenges. But I think actually the context it's coming into now is, well, how do we do this? How do we move forward? In fact, Scotland is now becoming much more politically drawn around this, having a majority in Parliament in support of basic income as we stand just now, let alone going into future elections. In fact, you have the Welsh First Minister has called for experiments previously, was very interested in the idea. The letter that Cleo mentioned earlier, and the early day motion, was signed by every political party at Westminster apart from the Conservatives. Even the DUP signed it, which I don't want to comment. But I think the context has changed. I think where there's an interesting space is possibly around very small experiments or tests. And what I mean by that is it gives you a space for the stories. I don't think the data is actually going to be the clinching bit now, because you can't test the whole system. I think what's going to be interesting, and this goes back to Cleo's call to pensioners, but also to many others, carers, people in gig economy. We need real people's life experiences, stories, what they need to get from this. I think possibly testing that with small groups could be really powerful. There was an experiment in Ontario in Canada, which was sadly cancelled due to a change of government a couple of years ago. And there's a fantastic set up by an artist called Jesse Golem, called The Humans of Basic Income. I recommend you check it out on social media. And it captured people's stories of what they were starting to use a basic income for. A lot of it's heartbreaking. It was people changing their house so they could get their kids back. Learning, the person who talked about buying their first ever winter jacket because they'd never felt comfortable or had enough money to do it before. I think it's about the stories and the real life experiences now, and we can do that in small scale ways that maybe don't require DWP's involvement. But I think in terms of the overall experiments, I'm moving ever more to the fact that we're pushing for real radical change as soon as we can now.
Can I add to that and sort of to represent the different stances within the basic income movement? I do definitely agree that we need stories, and I think small-scale pilots in the UK would be wonderful. I'd love to see them as soon as possible because, well, firstly, I want people receiving a basic income as soon as possible. But I do, and I think I always sing the praises of the feasibility study group and this work that's been done in Scotland on an experiment, because it's such high quality. This is groundbreaking research that answers all these questions about how do you experiment with basic income, and can you? And they have really robust answers to that. And I think a lot of the problems with experimenting come from having to compromise the experiment. right from the start because they are expensive. So I think if you're able to experiment without making those compromises, then they are absolutely important. Like they're really making a very valuable contribution. But I do think there needs to be an element of essentially having decided you want to implement a basic income before you start experimenting, because then you're going to do experiments that test the important questions about how we make it work in practice. And with a change as big as a basic income, we do need to do that. We do need to make sure that it's not doing harm to people when it's implemented. As we've seen with universal credit, that system is a shambles and a nightmare for many people. Like, people are experiencing that nightmare. And I think experiments and this kind of really pragmatic, wonderful policy making is an opportunity for basic income, and that's the way that it should be implemented, and a real opportunity for Scotland, because we've started so strong with this, and if we continue in the same way, I think we could implement very quickly, and based on data collected by experiments, which I would advocate for.
Listen, we're coming to the end of the time that we've got available, and we're never going to be able to get through all the comments and questions that people have had coming in. I want to thank everybody who sent stuff in. Just very quickly, Steve has asked, can Cleo say when that report is due? I think that's about the Scottish pilot studies, the feasibility studies. I don't think we have a date yet for that, do we, Cleo? But it's in the next few months. I think we're expecting it. But we'll try and find out more about that and post it on social media. Someone called Ford has asked, doesn't UBI go hand in hand with a lack of a personal allowance? And I think most people would say yes. A UBI overcomes the need for that personal allowance of tax-free income. But it's, in my view, there are people on the right who would say it should be associated with a flat tax approach to income tax. From my point of view, it still needs a progressive approach to income tax, so that those who are much wealthier, are not getting UBI as well as absurdly high incomes without contributing a fair share to the public purse. And a progressive income tax is still necessary. And we've got a comment here from Linda from the Scottish Artists Union. We were talking about the mixed views within the unions at the moment. The Scottish Artists Union say they're currently exploring issues around UBI with their members, so they've appreciated the discussion. And it is really important to recognise that not all work is remunerated in the same way, not just at the same level, but there are particular kinds of work. Creative work is really important to having a decent, livable, joyful society. And creative work at the moment is often very low paid and very precarious. We have this kind of perception of people in arts and entertainments as just being the superstars. Actually, most people are, trying to make a living in pretty precarious circumstances. So it's really interesting that the Artists Union are interested in that. Listen, we're not going to be able to respond to all of these. If you've been watching, continue the discussion on social media. If you look at our post, you'll be able to find Jamie and Cleo as well, and hopefully they'll join in with some of the discussions on social media. Before we finish, I would like you both to respond to one particular comment, though. This one's from Martha. It says, a UBI will allow us to be creative and do the things we find joy in. It says, we've been plagued by the idea of scrounging, of being productive. We are all productive by nature. We do things. And for me, it comes back to this notion that UBI just fits with a more authentic understanding of what human nature is, of how human beings want to live and can live. And a universal basic income, far from making people less productive, I think would free people up to be productive in the ways that are meaningful for them. Do you want to give us one final comment from each of you, just in response to that notion that this is actually about a more positive and life-affirming kind of economic system than the slightly kind of soul-destroying treadmill that people are forced onto at the moment? Cleo, do you want to?
Yeah, definitely. So, I completely agree with that comment. I think it was beautifully phrased. It's difficult to improve on it, but I agree that productivity is it's become a strange obsession. But actually, I think true productivity that leads to well-being needs to be tied to meaning. And I don't think the kind of productivity we're forced into is tied to meaning. It's tied by necessity and survival, because you need an income to survive, and your productivity is tied to your income. And for me, that's fundamentally what the beauty of a basic income would be to remove those things from each other, and to allow people to follow their innate needs of doing something meaningful and productive, without it being about survival and about fulfilling someone else's purpose.
Jamie, any last comments from yourself?
Absolutely. I think that was beautifully said by Martha. And I think, Natalie Bennett was asked, what could you guarantee about basic income? And she said that more poetry would be written. And I think she was kind of ridiculed at the time, but actually this is really, to me, sums up the kind of creative, positive space we could have. I think we're in a situation just now where we've been focused before this crisis on many people just trying to survive. I think it's about creating an environment in which people can actually thrive and do the things that matter. And that will not just lead to better communities and better individuals, but a better world, because I think that's the kind of world where we will focus more on the big challenges around the climate and around how we function as society. So, yeah, this is an emancipatory opportunity for society. And I think it's up to all of us, as Cleo said, to work together to make sure that happens and happens in the best way possible.
Well, as I said at the start, lots of us, everybody is trying to figure out new ways of working and new ways of doing our jobs and living our lives in the current circumstances. Green Live is part of that, but these deep conversations that we want to be having are about how we build back better, how we make sure that recovery from this crisis actually means building a fairer and greener society, an economy that's better than the broken normal that we had before. We don't want to go back to the worst of what we had before. We want to rebuild something that's better. UBI is part of that, but that argument, I think, applies to so much more of what we're doing. And as I said earlier, next week, Lorna Slater will be hosting the Green Live discussion with some of the climate strike movement, some of the leaders and activists in the climate strike movement in Scotland. They have done something really exciting and creative about the response to the climate emergency. This current situation is a challenge for them. How do you maintain a climate strike movement when you can't gather together for demos, for marches? A lot of them are doing that. That's the generation that's more networked than any generation's ever been. So they're being really creative in finding ways to continue that climate strike movement, and also to recognize that one of the things this pandemic is showing is that actually, when we choose to respond with urgency to something that we say is an emergency, we can make really substantial changes. And the climate emergency demands that of us as well. So as we think about the kind of better society we want to build after this, about what recovery really means if we're serious about building back better, I hope you'll join Lorna next week for a discussion about the contribution to that agenda that the climate strike movement is making. For the meantime, thank you again to both Jamie and Cleo for joining me in the discussion. Thank you for your questions, and we'll try to continue engaging on the various social media platforms to answer any questions that haven't been addressed in the discussion so far. Thanks very much, and don't forget to join Lorna 2 p.m. next Friday for that climate discussion.